Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise.
In his house in Relay, dead, Cthulhu waits dreaming. Returning to my Codex series on culture, I wanted to keep with the autobiographical theme that I had chosen for the series. Moving on to the first installment, which largely overviewed the first serious science fiction book I fell in love with as a young teenager, I wanted in the second installment to go over the first book that really shaped my view on politics. However, I realized that I couldn't, in the spirit of things, move forward without taking a key digression to yet another science fiction author that radically changed my perception about what fiction could be, and that was none other than H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I understand that this is yet another unoriginal selection for the series. Right after Dune, I'm sure that there is no more typical selection for a young bookish teenager than to get into the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, the famous horror writer from the 1920s. And unlike Dune, despite the fact that I enjoyed the stories while reading them, I can't think of any way, at the time, they really influenced my perception on storytelling, fiction, or culture. For those who aren't familiar with the kind of stories Lovecraft wrote, they are assuredly pulp stories. And while they touch on deep underlying themes, the author really doesn't directly address philosophical concepts the way you might see in some science fiction novel like Dune. But nevertheless, Lovecraft did teach me something profound about the human condition. In many ways, I absorbed it without even being aware of the lesson that was being taught. And much of this lesson really came into focus when I came across two other film reviews from the progressive side of YouTube. One by the YouTuber Cuck Philosophy, concerning the Lovecraft-inspired movie Hellraiser, another directly about the author and his works, done by hbomberguy. While I enjoyed both videos, when I watched the review, I realized that there was something critical that each author was missing, something fundamental about how the human psyche perceived horror that Lovecraft understood, and that many of his contemporary fans do not. It was the reason why I originally picked up Lovecraft's works as a younger teenager, and it's why I continue to return to them now. But as usual, I'm getting ahead of myself. Who was H.P. Lovecraft, and what are his stories even about? Well, to be brief, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was an eccentric American writer who lived in the first half of the 20th century, situating himself in Providence, Rhode Island. Virtually unknown during his own life, Lovecraft wrote horror stories for a pulp audience. Lovecraft's chief interest was the American horror story, into which he sought to combine the classic Gothic elements from the 19th century with newer up-and-coming forms of science fiction and surrealism. Lovecraft wrote prolifically, and while his prose is certainly not transparent or crisp, his stories did get quite a bit of fame after his own death, largely due to their key imagistic influence on other more popular authors, most notably authors like Stephen King and filmmakers like John Carpenter. Lovecraft's short stories typically concern accounts of various investigators who come in contact with supernatural entities, typically nefarious supernatural entities connected to some larger cosmic power. These horrific eldritch forces almost always have dark designs for humanity and the Earth in general, and much of the horror that Lovecraft describes is simply the realization that larger unstoppable forces seek the inevitable doom of both the protagonist and the human race writ large. These creatures could be described as gods or malevolent demons, and are only really held at bay due to their extreme remoteness and humans' native ability to not perceive their place in the universe. Of course, Lovecraft stories feature more conventional figures like ghouls and cultists and straight-up monsters, but his most iconic creatures are always the all-powerful, nefarious, great old ones who lurk behind the scenes. Described as inconceivable to the human mind, typically Lovecraft portrayed them either as some sort of tentacle monster, e.g. his most famous creation, Cthulhu, or as some sort of strange imperceivable geometry, conglomerations of spheres and cubes that would, in toto, be impossible for the human mind to fully comprehend. As is typical in all Lovecraft stories, the protagonists usually meet a very grim end, either in death or more often in insanity. Building on a previous tradition of American horror, obviously started by Poe, it's quite easy to see Lovecraft as simply a combination of 19th century horror fiction, such as that of Robert W. Chambers, with a then novel sci-fi aesthetic. But I think given Lovecraft's persistence as a figure both in horror and science fiction, we have to look a little bit deeper and ask what makes Lovecraft such an enduring figure. I mean, to be honest, it certainly isn't Lovecraft's writing style, which to any modern reader comes off as laborious and much too overwrought. It isn't even really the stories either, most of which just play off as your typical horror scenario, albeit set in the 1920s, where each single protagonist of course does the exact wrong thing, decides to investigate the tomb further when they should be going for a backup, presses on with arcane studies that are obviously driving them insane, and so on and so on. So why do people keep on coming back? To be quite honest, as a teenager, my appreciation of Lovecraft was fairly superficial at some level. I liked Lovecraft because he was dark, moreover because he painted a vision of the world that was dark. It wasn't a mere ghost or goblin in some particular place at some particular time. It was a vision of a universe dominated by darkness. And each ghost story, each horror story was a way of getting a little bit further into that ultimate horror. I didn't want to hear about how some adventurer or another met their end at the hands of a ghoul. I wanted to hear a story about how someone might be swallowed up by a larger and more demonic force, a force that might be able to consume them not only in body, but in soul, to eradicate humanity in essence and in spirit. And that danger always seemed to be lurking behind the scenes in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. And it's what I found the most fascinating. It was an emotion I would call less fear and more true horror. But here I have to take a step back. I remember first coming in contact with this feeling of horror as a much, much younger child, not through any story, but by looking at a set of paintings. The first being The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel the Elder. The second being The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. I remember encountering these paintings as a younger child and being struck with a very distinct sense of aversion. Again, it wasn't fear, but I felt like I couldn't look directly at them. When I flipped through a book of art that contained the pictures, I had to put my hand over the page that contained The Triumph of Death because I didn't want to look right at it. It seemed draining. And the same thing was true when I came across Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, of course, these are two of the most famous paintings from the Flemish Renaissance in the 16th century, but they both in turn depict a kind of universal apocalypse. Just starting with Bruegel's The Triumph of Death, the picture depicts a group of humans being massacred by the undead, by skeletons risen from the grave, or perhaps what might be described as emissaries of the Grim Reaper. The human victims pathetically flee from their tormentors, fighting back futilely at times, celebrating the last moments of life before the dead fall upon them and destroy them. We see the skeletal horses of the Legion pull forward what seem like crops of skulls. The dead bury the living, robbing what possessions they have. There even appears to be a dead dog feasting on a child. As we look up, we see that the fighters are surrounded by unending legions of the dead, while those who flee passively are herded into compartments like cattle, presumably to be slaughtered later. As we look up from the forefront of the painting, we see that the perversity continues. The dead participating in executions of the living, casting nets to catch the stragglers, and huge hecatombs burning into the night. As the view broadens, we understand that this same scene of horror is continuing, onward and outward, again and again and again. until it seems like this perverse genocide of the living by the dead has consumed the entire earth. Everything is barren, and all we can see in the background are fires and black smoke, repetitions of the same scene of horror that's depicted in the foreground. There is no meaning, there is no moral to the story. We might read the painting as some kind of warning that all men must die, but yet again, classically in Christian imagery, such a sentiment of memento mori is juxtaposed behind an idea of judgment, behind an idea that there is a way to live a good life and to live a wicked one. In Bruegel's masterpiece, there is no such guiding order, there is no such divine plan, and the perversity of the world just continues on, ever more outwards. It seems like the entire universe is a cruel joke, played at the expense of the people who live in it, and everything else in existence is simply a pantomime. Worse yet, the dead figures who seem to be in possession of the true knowledge of what the universe is about seem to take a certain amount of glee in tormenting those living, in carrying out their grim execution, and everything seems perversely inverted, not right, unhealthy, but in an extreme and almost transcendental way. A similar scene is shown in Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, a 3-panel painting that on the far left side depicts a more or less typical depiction of the Garden of Eden. However, as we move to the center panel, we see the same Garden of Eden now transformed, not by God, but by what appear to be the descendants of the garden's original inhabitants, Adam and Eve. The panel depicts a community of humans that seem to be living out every carnal and fantastic desire humanity could possibly undertake, joining in raucous celebration with animals and fountains, giant birds, and buildings that look almost plant-like growing organically out of the scenery. Everyone seems at play, and at once it feels like some kind of description of John Lennon's Imagine. Everything is in the moment. Everything is without care. And yet, as we look deeper into the second panel, things seem to be going slightly wrong. The scenes of revelry move from the fantastic to what only could be described as the perverse. And we wonder if what we're seeing here is something that should be celebrated or a warning. And of course, this is answered in panel 3, a depiction of what only could be hell. Here would appear to be the revelers, or perhaps the descendants of the revelers, are tormented by demons, by creatures that may have once been spirits or may have come from some combination of human, animal, and demon. We notice the same pastimes taken by the revelers now pushed to demonic extremes. Pleasure and pain are confused. Everyone has lost their way. The light is fading. And as the scene pulls back, we see that this demonic torment continues on forever. Whatever humanity had chose, either in the first panel or the second, there is no more hope ahead of it, only more horrors locked in the prison of their own chaotic design. Once more, the Garden of Earthly Delight seems to ask more questions than it answers. No one exactly knows what Hieronymus Bosch was intending to depict in these 3 scenes. The typical explanation is this is God's original design of the garden, followed by what a post-fall humankind would have done to the Garden of Earthly Delights if they had been given their own leave. For my money, this explanation is as good as any, but it still doesn't capture the emotion, the feeling that the world we are seeing in front of us is being devoured and being consumed in the most horrific way imaginable. It is rightly a fate worse than death, an end that seems to mock what it even means to be human, to pervert and downplay the pleasures and achievements we thought we had in our own lives. This is a feeling of true horror, and it's a feeling that I encountered in very few places. Of course, there is always that creeping feeling of a well-told ghost story, the suspicion that some ancient guilt might haunt you. One could even say that this form is taken to a very imaginative place in the mind of Edgar Allan Poe, who adds in, I think, a key psychological component to the gloom and despair of his own macabre tales. Yet I think it is possible to take things one step further, to try not to just strike at a tale of the macabre, and instead find a tale that describes a macabre and horrific existence. And this is where I think Lovecraft entered in. Two of the stories that have stuck with me the longest, The Dunwich Horror and Shadows over Innsmouth, feature a very particular kind of macabre description that it's hard to find in a lot of other stories in the horror genre. Both describe, in effect, certain isolated populations in New England that, through their association with demonic and eldritch forces, have become mutated and insane. While the protagonists clash against these people, cultists, and groups, we are left with a sense in both stories that the antagonists have not so much degenerated in their mutation and their cultic worship of these demonic entities, but have in some sense transcended, have tapped into a higher order reality, the ultimate truth behind the universe. In Shadows over Innsmouth in particular, the protagonist finds that the same pollution that caused the physical and psychological perversion over the denizens of the town Innsmouth is also in his veins, and he feels the same mental and physical transformations overtake himself. He has become what he has most feared, and what he has most feared is somehow more closely allied with the truth of the universe than his ordinary human existence. When I originally read Lovecraft, I deeply felt that this emotion of horror needed to be better explained, and I still believe that now. Of course, when analyzing the meaning behind Lovecraft, modern explanations often gravitate around Lovecraft's well-known racism. And it's true, Lovecraft did have very racist attitudes. Even for his time, which was the 1920s, quite a racist time. This was the period known for the emergence of eugenics. Lovecraft's views were somewhat bigoted in comparison to his contemporaries. It might be easy to see how a story about self-horror, about transformation, could be some kind of nascent fear about one's own genetic lineage. But I believe that this simplistic explanation doesn't go far enough. There are more ways to explain Lovecraft's style of transcendental horror. I came back to this question recently upon seeing one YouTuber, Cuck Philosophy's video on the horror series Hellraiser. Hellraiser, a story about demons that falls squarely within the popular late 80s genre of slasher movies, certainly has some Lovecraftian elements, with interdimensional beings awaiting those who seek certain extreme forms of pleasure and truth. Cuck Philosophy goes into this and tries to contrast it to the usual horror formula, pointing to how the creator of Hellraiser was trying to get away from merely physical terror and point instead towards some kind of transcendental limit experience. Perhaps this is a way of reconceptualizing what horror is. Less a story about society resisting monsters from the outside, more about the contrast between the normal and those who transcend the normal, who become perverse to achieve something outside of everything that we ordinarily recognize as human. I really enjoyed Cuck Philosophy's video, and it had some very interesting elements to it. Some minor quibbles aside, of course. I don't think classic horror has ever had monsters be entirely external. In the classic ghost story formula, the supernatural entity is always a response to some guilt perpetrated by the society or people in ordinary human existence. In traditional horror, the monster is almost never a pure outsider. Still, Cuck Philosophy's point about the limit experiences mentioned by George Bataille struck a chord and seemed to go to the heart of my speculations about what made Lovecraft great. The pursuit of the limit, the pursuit of the truth, an attempt to get beyond, is always what motivates the protagonists in all Lovecraft stories, and it's what inevitably brings them in contact with the horror that lies at the heart of all things. But I feel that fundamentally we are missing something when we look at things just in terms of the ordinary and the limit experience. Indeed, Cuck Philosophy was right to point out, as was George Bataille, that limit experiences in the form of transcendence and their contrast to normal, utilitarian existence is a fundamental element in both our understanding of the sacred and the horrific. There is something unifying in both the awful and the awesome. They invoke what is outside of what we know, of what we should experience in our ordinary animal lives. However, I feel at the core, in Cuck Philosophy and I think George Bataille's interpretation of this reality, we have a problem. There's a fundamental element where we have unlearned things that we seem to have known in the past. And what I think we have unlearned is the distinction between the divine and the demonic. We all fear the devil, we all fear ultimate evil. And great spiritual masters have said that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Indeed, both the demonic and the divine invoke in us a certain amount of awe and terror. They are limit experiences, but they are at the end of the day different limit experiences. Even if we might feel terror and excitement in the presence of either of them. Returning once more to Renaissance art, we can see this depicted clearly. This is a limit experience. This is a limit experience. This is a limit experience. And while we're at it, this is a limit experience too. Yet there is a distinct difference. We can see a dividing line form. There is more than just normal and transcendent. There is a distinction that we instinctively have. A fundamental difference between the sinister and the compassionate. A fundamental difference between love and hate, between the flesh that is mortified in martyrdom and the flesh that is corrupted by demonic touch. When humans contact the divine, we are filled with fear, but it is a fear that in our imperfect state, the divine will burn us away, will expel us justly from its presence. Similarly, we have fear in a demonic presence, but it is quite different. It's inverted. Here we know that however much we are attracted to that which is twisted, that however seductive and even transcendent the offers are before us, we know that if we accept them, we will fundamentally destroy what is worthwhile in our own souls. The distinction in ordinary human experience can be subtle, but it's there, and it's something that our civilization understood well in the past. In some ways, I'm afraid that we may be losing this. And in losing this, losing a good understanding of what true horror actually is. I feel I see this problem made manifest in a recent video by the progressive YouTuber hbomberguy about H.P. Lovecraft himself. In the video, hbomberguy tries to come to terms with his own enjoyment of H.P. Lovecraft's horror mythos, comparing it to one late 90s film adaptation, which he, as a teenager, disliked but later came to enjoy, that replaced H.P. Lovecraft's horror subtext with one about sexuality and being a lifestyle minority inside mainstream society. After discussing H.P. Lovecraft's well-known racism, hbomberguy goes on in his video to assert that perhaps H.P. Lovecraft's genre of horror fiction might be improved by entirely subverting the core of its horror element, ignoring what might seem threatening and perverse about the outsider and embracing the difference, becoming one with what is alien and what seems at first like it is horrific. hbomberguy continues his analysis by saying, in not too few words, that the ideal Lovecraft would have written stories not unlike Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, which, like H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, features a type of fish-like god creature that instead of being treated as a horror villain, is embraced as a friend by the film's protagonist and later as a lover. This consummation between the alien and the normal is, at least in this analysis, the true end of Lovecraftian horror. What H.P. Lovecraft would have communicated if he hadn't been stifled by his racist and bigoted early 20th century beliefs. And I have to hand it to hbomberguy, that is nothing if not an interesting theory. But is it true? In all honesty, if this is the approach we are taking to horror, Lovecraft or not, we're not really talking about reforming the genre or reimagining it, we're just talking about denying it. We're talking about reimagining the artistic form to such an extent that one would not even be able to understand the emotion and motivation behind a painting like Peter Bruegel's The Triumph of Death or Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. We have effectively unlearned the horror instinct. And of course, if you're progressively minded like hbomberguy and you see the instinct of revulsion, horror, and self-disgust, or even revulsion to the world as it is, as fundamentally derived from bigotry and racism of the past, perhaps a total rejection of this human perception is in order, but I think it leaves us more impoverished. less able to understand the world as it is, to understand human nature as it exists. Peter Bruegel's Garden of Earthly Delights seems to come from a more human era than anything created by Guillermo del Toro, and it certainly seems to contain, at its heart, a message that seems truer to life, that is grittier, that is more visceral. And I think we see where this type of thinking ends in a movie like The Shape of Water. The Shape of Water remains a thoroughly petty movie, billing itself something along the lines of a Beauty and the Beast story. Overdone but not bad in itself, the film goes on to string along a line of progressive platitudes about the 1950s and the relative oppression of groups, patting itself on the back for being on the right side of issues that were decided 70 years ago, just before telling the story of a janitorial worker at a military industrial research complex who befriends a non-verbal but highly intelligent fish creature, abducts it to prevent an autopsy, and then proceeds to sleep with it before attempting to release it into a non-native environment, whatever good that will do. The movie being so self-involved in its own congratulation over its moralness and ability to stand up for the little guy doesn't even realize that the main character is committing a serious moral transgression, sexually forcing herself onto a strange creature who does not even have the verbal wherewithal to understand that it should not eat the local house cat. By any conventional definition, by any feminist definition, the movie is celebrating rape. But of course, that's not part of the plan. The only designated villain, of course, is the leader of the military-industrial research complex, the stereotypical white male, who is simultaneously pathetic and in possession of an unending capacity for cruelty. Here, ire can safely be placed. He is the antagonist, a pathetic one who exists to be defeated, and who possesses no real horror unto himself other than the physical intimidation he's able to bring to a scene before his eventual defeat at the end of the movie, which we all knew was going to come. We are led to hate the villain in The Shape of Water, but nobody is afraid of him, not in any real sense. And this brings us to some interesting observations. Of course, most people might think that this is an incredible digression, and in many ways it is. The Shape of Water certainly isn't classified as a horror movie. It's something along the lines of a Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. Except in the mind of hbomberguy, there probably is very little comparison to H.P. Lovecraft, fish creature aside. Nevertheless, these progressive-oriented quasi-horror films give us a good eye to where the mistake of dismissing horror altogether leaves us, whether we restructure them as simple limit experiences with no notion to whether it is a divine limit experience or a demonic one, or simply restructure the entire concept of horror as an insider-outsider dynamic, one that needs to be overcome. It seems like we end up somewhere like The Shape of Water. We remove the boundary between ourselves and the other, only to find not a limit experience, but a narrative of self-congratulation, of easy answers, where the crimes of the protagonist are glossed over because they would complicate the narrative. If one wanted to rewrite The Shape of Water in order to rescue the horror aspects of it, to make it a movie that at least had an element of the previous horror dimension, or at least a little bit interesting, one might include some realization of the abuse visited by the protagonist upon the captive fish creature. In a moment, the hero might realize that in following their own selfish desires, they had become just as horrible as the villain, and in that there would be genuine horror. The beast lives within, but of course I'm not expecting anything like that from a director like Del Toro. Evil is something that a certain class of people do or did 50 years ago that we're now beyond, and we can't have the narrative disrupted by any notion that it's eternally springing up from the human soul. That would just be silly or regressive, now wouldn't it? And here we come to the real deficit, and that is that I don't think you can have a concept of genuine horror without having a genuine concept of evil. Certainly, we can talk about horror as having a transcendent quality, as is obviously the case with Lovecraft and in the works of George Bataille. But structuring it this way misses a key component: the recognition that evil is truly evil, not just an extreme of experience. It is a terrible end, an obliteration of all that is interesting, of all that gives forward existence and life unto other things, and a descent into pure chaos and oblivion. Good horror utilizes the fact that deep down humans understand that true evil exists. It exists and needs to be confronted. And its confrontation is not an excuse for the status quo. As a matter of fact, most of the time the status quo generated that very evil. Great horror, I would say, goes always a step further and reminds the human subject that they are the source, that this anathema that might extinguish everything that is good about the universe blooms eternal in their own souls, and that if it awakens, and it always does awaken, and is not immediately confronted, it could flower forth into horrific results beyond our ability to immediately imagine. In other words, if humans are left in the garden of earthly delights, we will end up, as Hieronymus Bosch foresaw it, twisting it into a demonic pit, either on a personal level or a universal one. And this is the hell that lurks behind everything. If there is not goodness there, they can confront what we know lurks inside of ourselves. I think this is why horror classics like The Shining often toy with the juxtaposition of a universal environmental evil with a personal evil, as if the personal decision to pursue wickedness was the seed that unlocked eldritch horrors that hid behind everything else, sleeping and dormant until the right moment. We see this again in perhaps the best Lovecraftian adaptation in recent years, although it does not directly bill itself as such, True Detective, which juxtaposes the protagonist's own moral failings against a set of increasingly gruesome murders. At times, it seems like one is driving the other. It's funny enough that both Clive Barker, the creator of Hellraiser, as quoted in Cuck Philosophy's video, as well as Michelle Welbeck, who is cited in hbomberguy's video, point out that horror as a genre is fundamentally reactionary. And indeed, I think this is very accurate. Horror is fundamentally reactionary, and as culture becomes increasingly more progressive, I think we'll lose our ability to accurately capture its initial magic. I think we will increasingly lose our ability to describe horror accurately. Horror is reactionary because it relies on the reactionary model of evil. And the reactionary nature of horror really does not have anything to do with the relationship to the status quo. In fact, quite the opposite. The reactionary is suspicious of the status quo, just as he is suspicious of the soul of man, because he knows both contain the seeds of evil. To the progressive, evil is something that happens, that perpetuates itself for a time before it's ultimately solved and we move on. This is why directors like Del Toro are frequently reaching backwards to the 30s and 50s to get their movie villains. But reactionaries understand that no such final resolution to evil will ever occur. It is a natural process. Human beings return to evil. Human beings return to wickedness because it's their nature. And in every status quo, in every modern society, we have the seeds and guilt of past events, which will flower forth into new acts of evil in the future. We cannot reform this away, and while society might progress technologically, we are stuck in the cycle of the fall of man, and this generates the instinct for horror. The knowledge that there are monsters, that men are monsters, that the history of man is monstrous and will continue to be monstrous, that the universe itself might indeed have a demonic quality and may be destined in some way to come to a monstrous end, as shown by Peter Bruegel. The reactionary knows that the monster and the horror exists in their own very soul, and this is what Lovecraft was good at capturing as well. Lovecraft was no Christian, he was no believer like I am, but he understood well the struggle inside man's heart, that although we had the will towards transcendence, that transcendence might have no good end. This is a problem much older than racism and bigotry, and much more fundamental to the future of humanity's existence. I find it no surprise that people deeply pessimistic about the progress of mankind, about the prospects of man in this new technological age, often use imagistics taken from Lovecraft to describe how they feel about the emergence of new technology like genetic engineering or artificial intelligence. These are eldritch horrors that can, like Cthulhu, abolish everything that dare call itself human. And in this context, if nowhere else, the language of horror will be supremely useful. While I, from a Christian background, think that there is always hope, that there is always reason to fight back against the darkness, there is always valor in pushing back against the eldritch horrors that lie both at the edge of the universe and inside the human soul. Still, H.P. Lovecraft's works are not designed to convey that hope. But I will say this, H.P. Lovecraft, with all his reaction, with all his bigotry, provided a template for understanding horror in a new way, in a distinct way. His works expanded my own imagination as to the truly horrific, and what humans might have to face when they face the truth. That understanding, that artistic language, isn't remotely what humans need to confront the darkness of the world, but it is in many ways a starting place, the beginning of a journey that starts with, as H.P. Lovecraft put it, humanity's most primal emotion, fear.